Where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices, and then distill from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today I'm doing the third episode of a 24 episode long program that really looks to aggregate military doctrine and apply it in a systematic way to running our businesses. And so this is the third topic on strategy, and there's I think I've divided the 24 episodes into 5 categories. So I think we've got 1 or 2 more in the strategy category, and then we'll move on to the next one. So today I'm going to be talking about strategic patience. And I have to say that, the old saw is patience is a virtue. And if only we all were, as virtuously patient as we need to be, right? I think it's one of the most difficult qualities to acquire. I'm not sure anybody has it naturally. So, if we look at what's going on in the business in the business world, in the economy today, so we're in another period of uh, technological change, perhaps even upheaval. Certainly globally, um, the situation in terms of trade, in terms of tariffs, relations between countries is is volatile, and so how all of this is going to end up, I think, is difficult to say, and I think there is a sort of inclination to do something, right? You've got to do something. Well, here's the thing. Oftentimes doing something doesn't help, and it may make things worse. And so this idea of strategic patience, I think, is particularly apt to where things are at today, because it's going to be the companies who have a clear vision, or I should say a clear strategy. Vision sounds very sort of woo woo woo, vision, but a clear strategy, that have confidence and have the patience to each day do the things that need to be done, that will end up being the ones to benefit, if not just work their way through all of the change that's going on economically and geopolitically in the world today. So I'll take an example of, well, actually, I'm going to save that example for when I get into how we can apply strategic patience to our businesses. Let's, as is the custom on the show, let's first look at the military perspective, in this aspect of doctrine. So when we talk about strategic patience, especially in war, right? So what we're really talking about is pursuing long-term objectives without overreacting to short-term pressures. Okay, so we will we from a military standpoint, we're going to emphasize endurance over speed. We're going to emphasize containment over confrontation. We're going to emphasize preservation of resources. We're going to look to control escalation. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to look to align with political and economic capacity or reality when decisions are made from a military perspective. Okay, so excuse me. If we take, for example, World War II. Okay, World War II lasted, at least the actual declared part of the war for the United States, began on December 8th, 1941, and it ended in August of 1945. So just shy of 4 years, about 3 years and roughly 8 months. Okay. So there was a lot of pressure early in the war to do something. And that pressure was coming from a number of sources. Part of it was coming from Joseph Stalin, the leader of the USSR, who wanted the Allies, primarily the United States and Great Britain, to launch an invasion into Western Europe to take off part of the pressure that he was experiencing on the Eastern Front. Okay. And he pressed and pressed and pressed for this. And I think wisely, especially Winston Churchill, really, he didn't fall prey to that pressure by Stalin, because although England had been fighting already for 2 or 3 years, the United States was a new entrant to the war, starting at the very end of 1941, and really needed to figure out how it was going to act militarily, and more importantly, how it was going to be successful militarily. So although there was some activity in the Pacific, most notably the Battle of Midway, which happened in the earlier part of 1942, Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, didn't take place until toward the end of 1942. And by the way, Stalin was not the only person pressing for action. There was political pressure from within the United States to do something as well. But the reality was that neither the United States Army nor Navy was particularly well manned at the time of Pearl Harbor. And so personnel needed to be drafted, recruited, put through training, equipped. All of that had to happen, as well as industrial production aimed at building the materiel of war: planes, tanks, guns, ammunition, jeeps, all of these things that needed to be brought up to an even higher level than it had been in 1941, where the United States was supplying some materiel to Great Britain and Russia, but now needed to equip our own armed forces in addition to our allies. So all of this took time, and it took patience on the part of leadership, both civilian and military leadership. So both Frank Knox, who was the Secretary of the Navy, and I'm going up on the name of the Secretary of the Army. I've lost his name, but both of them realized that their services needed to be expanded and properly equipped before they engaged in major combat operations. So did George Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army, and Ernest King, who was Chief of Naval Operations. So, and the combatant commanders as well, they too were not in favor of taking precipitous action, because they knew a couple of things. One is, if they lost, that would have a terrible impact, not only, of course, on the killed and wounded, but also on the overall morale of the members of the armed forces and the morale of the public, whose support was needed in order to pay for and build, and from whom would be recruited the personnel that would be necessary to win the war. So all of that required patience, and indeed, it was the right approach. So another example of strategic patience from a military standpoint is the Cold War. So the Cold War indeed may be the defining example of strategic patience. So rather than fighting a hot war with the Soviet Union, right, the United States and her allies really chose to play the long game, as as we say in sports, in dealing with the Soviet Union and the communist threat. So the ends that were sought in the Cold War were to prevent Soviet expansion and preserve the Western economic system, i.e., capitalism. The ways that that was done was through containment, deterrence, creating alliances, and creating greater economic integration, in particular in the West among what the Western so-called democracies. They're really all republics, but among Western countries who had an essentially capitalist-based system. And then the means that were used in it to eventually defeat the Soviet Union were, first of all, industrial capacity. Now, by the end of World War II, uh, the Soviet Union had expanded its industrial capacity, although it was still significantly smaller than that of the United States. But having the expanded economic capability that was developed during World War II, the what was needed was patience, so that the ability of the Western economic system to expand and innovate could eventually essentially crush the Soviet model of central planning and such. So that was number one. Another means was technological superiority. So a lot of the innovation that gave the Western economies their strength came through technological development. This was why, by the way, the launch of Sputnik, the first satellite by the Soviet Union, was so devastating to Western countries, especially the United States. It seemed to indicate that the Soviet Union was technologically innovating faster than the United States, and therefore was a much stronger and more formidable enemy than people in the United States thought. But in the event, um, the launch of Sputnik, um, and the advances that the Soviet Union was making in space exploration really had far more to do with the lack of any initiative to do that on the part of the United States than any ability of the Soviet Union to develop technologically and innovate more quickly than the United States. And indeed, when the space race was launched, and the space race was part of attaining victory in the Cold War, the United States pretty quickly surpassed what the Soviet Union was doing. And of course, it was an American who, or in essence, two Americans were the first to set foot on the moon. So the United States won the space race. Technological superiority and innovation was another means by which the Cold War was won. Another one, which was a ways but also a means, was create alliances, such as a NATO. So while NATO was really a military alliance, it also brought greater economic integration with it, because by uh, coordinating militaries more effectively, so things like weapons and weapons systems could be developed that were that could be used across members of the NATO alliance, more effectively. And so, we eventually saw, and again, the United States became the dominant military supplier throughout the Cold War, and today we see that uh, many of the planes, tanks, etc., that are used in the world are made by the United States, and sold to our allies. And in general, their technological capability is superior to pretty much everything else out there. And then finally, another aspect, another means for winning the Cold War was creating sustained public support. So here's the reality of the United States. You can say it's a cultural aspect, perhaps, but Americans don't like to sit home each night and watch the news or listen to the news and hear body counts. Indeed, this was one of the reasons why the Vietnam War became untenable. I remember as a boy watching the news each night. My father and mother watched CBS News with Walter Cronkite, and when there was reporting on the Vietnam War, one of the things that was always reported was the number of Americans killed, the number of South Vietnamese killed, and the number of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed. And it was always interesting because the number of the number of South Vietnamese killed, South Vietnam being America's ally, was always a multiple of the number of Americans killed. And then the number of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed was a multiple of the number of South Vietnamese killed. It was always interesting from my standpoint as a child to see that, and I never understood, why that was the case. Now, were those numbers accurate? Who knows at this point? But um, that I think that the way the numbers were presented was an attempt to sustain public support for the Vietnam War, and in the event, it just didn't work because there were too many Americans being killed. There was too much just death, destruction, wounding going on, and in the end, that's why I think Americans eventually turned against the Vietnam War. It wasn't half so much philosophical as it was just not liking to see, the body counts. So um, the so sustaining public support can be done much more easily without kinetic combat. Okay, and so people talk about the Afghanistan war lasting for 20 years. Well, yeah, one of the reasons it could last for 20 years is over that time period, relative to any other war, there were, few deaths. I'm not discounting the number of people who were killed, but just over a 20-year period, the number of deaths was quite low compared to if World War II, for example, had lasted for 20 years at this similar death rate. I mean, 500,000 Americans were killed in World War II. Several thousand were killed in Afghanistan over a 20-year period, right? And indeed, there was likely public support for military action to continue in Afghanistan uh, at the time that President Biden pull the American military presence out of Afghanistan. And one of the reasons why was there wasn't this sort of nightly, body count that indeed the number of deaths, especially in the latter half of the 20-year period, was remarkably low given what was at stake there and how difficult the situation was in Afghanistan. So rather than seeking a decisive clash in the Cold War, okay, U.S. strategy focused on time as a weapon, forcing systemic weakness by the Soviet Union to surface, right? And it was really an opportunity for the United States to use its long-term economic capacity and might to essentially outdo the Soviet economic model. And in the end, it was that, I think, coupled with as communication developed and people in the Soviet Union who were being told you have a great life, the more they saw what life was like in the West, they came to the conclusion, no, we don't. I mean, we don't have any of the stuff they have in the West. And so by taking the time to let the Soviet people see that, they, that in the end was what won the Cold War. So it was strategic patience. So speed in the Cold War would most likely have been a liability, not a benefit. First of all, it could have risked rapid escalation, even nuclear catastrophe, because both the United States and the Soviet Union had very large nuclear arsenals. And in the heat of war, one or more of those weapons might have been used, and that would have been disastrous. So another liability to using speed would have been overextending weakened economic conditions, domestic economic conditions. So during the Cold War, the United States was not continuously prosperous. It went through periods of recession, and so in order to sustain a war, especially what was almost for sure going to be a long-term war, uh, the United States needed to build its economy. And so if speed had been used, it could have easily overwhelmed American economic capabilities, especially to fight. If, for example, if the war was being fought on Russian territory or on Soviet territory, very, very much more difficult to sustain, and both, of course, militarily, but also economically. And sometimes tactical wins can produce strategic setbacks. So one of the ones that comes to mind is the United States was flying these large spy planes. They were called U-2s over the Soviet Union, collecting data, and one of them, I believe, was shot down. But anyway, it crashed, and the Soviet Union was able to hold that up. See, this is sort of like the fecklessness of the American system. And look, everybody knew everybody was spying on everybody else, but this sort of tactical loss became quite embarrassing for the United States. And so, multiply incidents like that, and very quickly, you have an erosion of public support. You have greater strain on the economic resources of the United States, and that's not a path to victory. That's a path to losing. So strategic patience requires leaders to absorb provocations without losing discipline. Okay, so strategic patience is not accommodating the enemy, letting them gain victories at cost to oneself, one's country. It's not. Uh, um, I'm trying to remember the word that. Oh my gosh. Um, Appeasement. It's not appeasing the enemy. What it is it's making an affirmative decision about how one is going to respond in the from a that's best from a strategic and a long view standpoint. Okay, so let's take. Actually, no, we're not going to take a break. Let's move on now to translating strategic patience into business. Actually, you know what? Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back to talk about the business lessons. When life brings unexpected changes, managing inherited property shouldn't add to your stress. Magnum Properties specializes in probate and trust real estate management. We handle the complexities while you focus on what matters most. From property maintenance to tenant relations, from legal compliance to maximizing value, we're your trusted partner through every step. Magnum Properties, Inc., turning property challenges into peace of mind. Call us today at 213 264 4396 or visit magnumprops.com. Okay, so now let's translate the military doctrinal idea of strategic patience into business. So, first of all, we need to match investment horizons to strategic reality. So the Cold War planning was assumed to be over, decades, not quarters. Okay, everybody, well, not everybody, but most people realize that unless we were prepared to essentially invade the Soviet Union and bring about regime change, it was going to be a long period. And so a Cold War was preferable to, once the United States made the decision to withdraw from Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, there was no way to effectively go back in, especially when after the massive military drawdown after World War II. So the only way to win the what was a sort of political and economic war against the Soviet Union was a long-term Cold War. So from a business standpoint, uh, infrastructure, platforms, investments in artificial intelligence, these all require long horizons. And looking at short-term return on investment metrics can kill the long-term advantage. So we see this playing out right now. So over the last maybe couple of weeks or so, all of a sudden it seems like investors are looking at these huge investments in AI that many companies are making, the Magnificent Seven, along with other companies. And all of a sudden, for some reason, they've decided that they're not going to pay off, or the time horizon to pay them for them to pay off is too long. They've gotten much more negative about them. But the reality is that AI, whether it's large language models, whether it's automation, these are fundamental changes in how economies, and indeed how economies are going to operate and how people are going to live their lives. And they're not going to be figured out in the short term. They're not going to be figured out in 2 quarters or 4 quarters or even 8 quarters. We're talking years and years for them to be figured out. We saw this before with when the internet was being developed, and how the impact that the internet has on our lives today, I don't think was anything like what was potentially conceived back in its nascency. The same thing with cell phones, especially smartphones. What we can do with a smartphone today right? When I pick up my iPhone, my little teeny iPhone, as somebody observed the other day, the computing power in that phone is in many cases as much as, if not larger than, the computing power in a mainframe computer 50 or 60 years ago. It's just quite astonishing. But it's taken that half century of technological development to figure out how that's going to play out. um, I was listening to an interview of the CEO for AT&T talking about his fiber optic, not his, but talking about AT&T's investment in fiber optics, how long it's been, how much longer it's going to take. These are long-term investments. They're going to take a long time to pay off, but they're how companies will stay competitive, if not dominate, in the future. And this is one of the challenges of the American economic system, especially the reporting of quarterly earnings. It puts pressure on CEOs to try and do something, right? Doing something is the opposite of strategic patience. And the reality is, although there are times when quick reaction is required, typically that's because something of a crisis nature has happened, and so there needs to be some sort of rapid response to it. So, for example, the Tylenols, not debacle, that when there was some poison Tylenol that killed some people. This is going back, I think, 25, 30 years ago. Strategic patience was not the right strategy for an incident like that. Okay. It had to be dealt with quickly and effectively. Okay. The debacle with Coca-Cola and New Coke. Okay. Once Coca-Cola saw that the public, its customers were rejecting New Coke, they had to respond rapidly to that problem. Okay. But in general, strategic patience is what's called for. So, among other things, patience allows compounding to work. So, for only gaining 2 to 3% a year in sales, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but compounded year over year over year, okay, that really builds up. It builds an ever stronger business. So, um, if if the payoff strategy, okay, so the payoff strategy, or the payoff horizon, I should say, needs to match leadership's tenure in order for this to work. Okay, and that's where it becomes a problem. So uh you take the example of Starbucks, which has had what, 3 or 4 CEOs over the last several years. I think one of the problems is Starbucks is a mature business. Its opportunities for rapid growth just aren't there like they were 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Okay. And the idea of bringing someone in who's going to turn things around in a year, it's not going to happen for a business of Starbucks size. And so Starbucks would be better off exercising strategic patience. Now, it appears that the new CEO who came from Chipotle is having some success. Perhaps he's just, you know, better able to deal with the problems that Starbucks faces, but he's also keeping things very low key. And that's the smart strategy. Doing a lot of flashy things that bring attention, create an atmosphere where people expect something to be done. That is the opposite of strategic patience. Okay. So leadership tenure needs to match payoff horizon on investments, and then the strategy of strategic patience will work. Okay, next. Businesses need to resist escalation in a competitive arms race. So Militaries in general have to avoid reacting to every single provocation, because sometimes those provocations are designed to create a cycle of reactions that are coming rapidly, so that the reactor can't think through what needs to happen, makes a mistake, and now loses a battle, and then that compounds, right? So we can see this in how military strategy is being handled by the current administration. Countries do things to provoke the United States, but we don't necessarily immediately respond. You can tell there's some strategic patience being exercised there, while a plan is figured out as to what to do. And then, oh, all of a sudden there's a response, and bang, whoever perpetrated the incident somehow ends up suffering greatly for what they're doing. So America's enemies, I think, make the mistake that because we're not necessarily responding quickly, we're weak and we're not going to respond. No, we're just taking our time to figure out how can we respond best in the way that will have the greatest impact with the least cost in lives and treasure to the United States. Okay, so in business, not every competitor's move deserves a response. And indeed, things like price wars and feature wars, hiring sprees, they often destroy value. So you look at what Facebook did. I think we're going now back about 6 months ago or so. They were going through this rapid hiring spree, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire people who Facebook, or Meta actually, thought could give a shot in the arm to their ability to develop AI. And in the event, most of the other companies did not respond to what Facebook was doing. They acted with strategic patience. And that's to their credit, because uh, Meta spent a ton of money, and then after a very short period realized, wait a minute, we're not using our resources wisely. Okay. And they were spending at such a rapid pace. I think they realized this is not sustainable, and so they had to back off. And the poaching of people from other companies, whether it was Chat GPT or Anthropic or whatever, that the poaching of that personnel appears to have, if not completely stopped, dramatically declined. Okay, it would have been a mistake for these other companies to start bidding up salaries to retain their personnel, because all that would have done is create a salary arms race, if you will, that would make the cost of developing artificial intelligence and developing strategies that will allow the investment to pay off. It would have made it more difficult, more costly, etc. So among the things that strategic patience did for the companies that didn't respond to Meta is it preserved their optionality. If there was a particular individual that a company just felt they had to retain, okay, they had the option of going after working to keep that one person without it being a general melee in terms of trying to retain all the personnel. Okay, so reactivity almost always signals weakness, okay, not strength. So I make a big distinction between the words react and respond. And we want to respond. Okay, so if a competitor is doing something that we think might damage our business, we don't want to react. We want to take some time, exercise some strategic patience, and then respond appropriately. First of all, determine, is this really a threat? And if it is, figure out what is the most effective way to respond. Okay, next. So we can, when we exercise strategic patience, we're using time to expose the fragility of a competitor. Okay, so endurance reveals structural weaknesses from a military standpoint, I should say. Endurance allows structural weaknesses of an enemy to become exposed. That is the essential lesson of the Cold War. By outlasting the Soviet Union, by outproducing the Soviet Union, by taking the time to show people in the Soviet Union that indeed what they were being told did not comport with reality, okay, the United States was able to win the Cold War, okay? But it was able to do that because the communist system is inherently weaker, okay? The idea that one person, or not literally one person, but a small group of people can control an economy in such a way that it will be stronger than an economy where millions of people, the decisions of millions of people, uh, work out to optimize what's best for the economy. It, the communist system is just not going to work. And by the way, we can see this happening to a certain extent in real time between the United States and China. So China, there's no doubt that China has a lot of economic strength, but undergirding its economic, should say, undergirding its position as the second largest economy in the world are a lot of structural weaknesses. So how they've dealt with real estate over the last 10 years or so has created a lot of structural weaknesses. And indeed, the collapse of real estate prices in China has made people, middle class people there, feel much poorer than they want to feel, right? The China's reliance on sort of low level industrial manufacturing, okay, means that they're not developing their workforce. Okay, China's one child policy that went on for decades, which favored uh, male children over female children, and has caused a huge imbalance so that there are millions and millions of young men who want wives, but there aren't enough young women to go around, has caused a big cultural problem in China, which adds to the economic fragility of that of their economy, right? So it's by no means a given that the Chinese economy is going to be able to endure. And indeed, it was projected that China was going to overtake the US economy a few years from now. Clearly, that is not going to happen. Okay, so so by by um, um, by taking the time to let a competitor's fragility become evident, strategic patience becomes an excellent strategy. So while the example with China is an economic one, let's look more specifically at a business. So from a business standpoint, so for example, unsustainable pricing, right? Pricing something at below cost. That's not a sustainable model. Now, sometimes businesses will think, well, I'm going to do that to grab market share, and then I'll increase my prices and become very profitable. So the problem with that is, unless the product, unless your competitor's ability to let me phrase this. Unless you're undercutting your competitor's pricing is going to essentially put them out of business, that strategy is not going to work. Okay, because your competitors will outlast you, and in fact, you'll be the one to go out of business because you're not even meeting your costs, let alone making any kind of profit to return to investors, right? Another problem that becomes exposed through strategic patience is over leveraged growth, right? So we see cases where this happened back in the dot-com boom, back in the early 1990s. Companies raised tons of money, they borrowed tons of money, they had visions of huge growth, and in the end, they couldn't sustain it. They were too over leveraged, and the growth in revenue just was not sufficient to deal with the leverage that these companies had, and so a huge number of them failed. Right now, people are trying to apply that lesson to, in particular, the Mag 7 with respect to their AI investments, but it's not an apt comparison because a lot of the funding for the AI investments by the Magnificent Seven is coming from actual cash flow revenue that these companies generate. I mean, these companies have huge revenue. Okay. And they're only just now beginning to look to, in some cases, borrow money. Okay. But the lenders, I've been listening to some podcasts discussing it. In general, it appears lenders are being, pretty conservative, pretty smart about how they're looking at the Mag 7 using leverage to fund their AI investments. And the idea that they're going to become over leveraged, well, of course it's possible, but I would say it's not particularly likely, at least as things are right now. Okay. And then finally, uh, using time to expose competitor fragility. Also, another factor in that is the cultural burnout. So companies that have a very, fast moving, we've got to be doing this isn't, they exhaust their people. So if we pursue a more disciplined, a more strategically patient strategy, we're likely to retain the resilience and capacity of our teams so that that growth can continue rather than wearing them out by constantly saying to them, do something. Right. I have a friend, I was actually talking to him last night, and he's with a tech company, and the CEO of the tech company came to him, I guess it was last week, and basically said, you got to do something about this. And he's had this discussion with his boss several times. He said, there's nothing to do. Okay. All that's going to happen if you force me to do something is I'm going to wear out my people the same way other parts of the company have worn out theirs, trying to do something that in the end doesn't pay off. Right. So patient firms let other companies exhaust themselves, but they look to play the long game. Okay. And eventually the market punishes impatience. Okay. Next, um, with from a strategic standpoint, we want to build institutions, not just products. Okay. So among the institutions that the Cold War built were NATO, which I've talked about before, but also a much leaner and yet lethal American military. Now, you might say, well, the American military isn't near as big as it needs to be these days. And I think in general, I would agree with you. However, the amount of force that the United States military can project today, kind of per service member, is far greater than it was half a century ago. And one of the reasons that's the case is because the military has looked to take advantage of what the United States, of the things for which the United States is most powerful, which is economic might and technological innovation. Okay, so what a single pilot of of a fighter attack aircraft can do today is enormous compared to what could be done in, say, World War II, or for that matter, even Vietnam. So this the building of alliances and the building up of lethality in the military. Okay, these are institutional programs, if you will. So over the last half century, one of the things that the United States military has done is dramatically increased its ability to work jointly, meaning the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force to work together in a much more cohesive factor. So I talked about this when I did the episode on the invasion of Grenada a few months ago, and I invite you to watch that episode to understand more about this. But at the time of the invasion of Grenada in the late 1980s, I believe it was, uh, you know, the Navy ships that were responsible for shelling, or not for shelling, I mean for landing the Marines and such, they couldn't communicate with the Marines once they got on shore. Right? It was crazy what went on. Today, those kind of problems just don't exist. Okay, and it's partly because of what the military learned in situations like Grenada. Okay, but and also for all the talk of the degrading of the NATO alliance, right? That's not what's really going on here. There is an effort actually to make the NATO alliance stronger, okay, by creating a true alliance, not one where all the other countries are essentially relying on the United States military, but rather looking to rebuild the military capacity of Germany, of France, of Great Britain, of the other members of NATO. Okay, so building institutions, not just products, is a factor of strategic patience. So in business, we want to look at governance, we want to look at culture, we want to look at systems, okay? Because it is through those factors that institutions are created and become enduring, right? So with one of the companies that I oversee as the administrator of an estate. So when I took over the company, the philosophy was very much do something and do it now, right? And the people that work there, they were exhausted. They were just beaten up. Okay. Now our cultural byword is we work to live. We don't live to work. Okay. There has to be some meaning behind going to the office each day, even though we work virtually, but going to work or doing our work each day. If we're doing our work only just because we're doing our work, that is not enduring. Okay, and some of the issues with which we're dealing are quite complex. Um, some of the factors are outside of our control. And so rather than doing something, we're taking a step back and figuring out how do we approach these problems. So we have a property, it's in the downtown LA area, it's besieged by they're called homeless people, but in this case it's really criminal vagrants masquerading as homeless people, right? And the city of Los Angeles has just not been proactive in dealing with these kind of problems. And the property about which I'm speaking is not the only one. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of properties in the greater downtown Los Angeles area that are suffering because of it, as well as the small businesses that occupy these properties. And so we've exercised strategic patience by, first of all, figuring out, okay, what are the roots of the problems here, and how can we deal with them effectively. And one of the best victories we've had is we've been able to convince staff members of the council person's office for that area of Los Angeles, there's a real problem here. And now the councilman's or the council person's office is engaged. And that's good because that also helps get the Los Angeles Police Department engaged, right? Individual officers, they knew what was going on. They wanted to help. But without the backing of their supervisors and the higher ups in the LAPD to commit the resources to do it, it's hard for the individual officers to have the impact that they want to have. Now we're starting to see that, right? And so that then coupled with the things that are within our control, better lighting for the property, fixing the property up so it's more presentable, right? Those things together will be what eventually brings success for us with this problem. Okay, but it's been by exercising strategic patience that we've been able to get there. Could have thrown a ton of money at it, wouldn't have been the right thing to do because in the end, without dealing with these outside issues, i.e. the city, etc., the money would have been wasted. Okay, so this is all part of building up the proper governance of this company and how it manages properties. It's part of redoing the culture there so that people feel valued, so that they can develop resilience, so they can take satisfaction in their professional accomplishments. Okay, and developing systems, right, so that we can work so that when things have to be done, we can do them with the least amount of time. We can do them most efficiently, right? And people know and can rely on how things are supposed to happen, right? So again, institutions outlast tactics. So this is another situation where if leadership is turning over rapidly, causing rapidly periodic changes in governance and culture and such, that is a problem, right? Stability of leadership is a critical part of strategic patience. Okay, and then finally, preserve strategic credibility. So deterrence in the Cold War worked because overall the United States was pretty consistent in how it pursued its policy. It didn't let itself get goaded into escalation or Lord forbid, nuclear escalation, right? We just kept pushing away economically, and as much as possible standing our ground militarily, and we wore the Soviet Union out. So from a business standpoint then, this translates into, first of all, creating stable relationships with our customers and clients by giving them a roadmap that they can see, okay, this is how this is going to work. So when customers or clients have problems, they can be worked through as long as they see that we have a plan, okay, that we're not doing things ad hoc. Okay, the employees also, they want to have predictable leadership. They don't want to feel like they're always operating on tenterhooks. Okay, and partners or investors, they want to invest in reliable firms where they have a sense that, okay, these people know what they're doing, they have a plan, they're going to calmly execute that plan, and so there's a high likelihood that it will be successful, right? So talking about the same company I mentioned in the last example, another client of the company had a property it's really been problematic for them. So among other things, it's occupied by a cannabis tenant, and the cannabis industry has largely collapsed here in Southern California. And the owner was really in a dilemma what to do. And in helping the company address that, my philosophy again was strategic patience. Let's just keep dealing with these issues calmly, rationally. Okay. Let's work with the tenant until it becomes completely not viable to work with the tenant. Let's deal with the problems as they come up thoughtfully. Let's not rush to make decisions. Let's communicate clearly and rationally to the client. Okay. And that'll work the problem through. And as a result, standing here today, I can tell you that this particular client is very happy at the resolution that she's gotten to this situation that really has taken probably the better part of a year, with kind of the most rapid movement happening over the last 2 or 3 months. Okay, but that's oftentimes how it happens. Strategic patience often pays off by then things working out quite rapidly because all the groundwork has been done. Okay, so inconsistency erodes advantage faster than competition, right? We need to play our game. We don't need to play into or be suckered by how the competition wants us to play the game. Okay. So again, uh, strategic patience is not passive, it's deliberate strength backed by confidence in a long term plan and positioning that we believe will be successful for our businesses. So that's the lesson behind the military doctrine of strategic patience. I encourage you to apply it to your business and professional practice. So we're running just a couple of minutes over time here. I thank you very much for joining me today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. I hope you'll join me then. And then next week, full slate of shows. Remember, every other Thursday is my show, Jiggers' Place, at 5 p.m. Pacific time. We have a cocktail and a schmooze. Hope you'll join me for that. If you have questions, comments, or criticisms, links to the show notes, links to social media will be in the show notes. Love to hear them. And that just leaves me to thank you again for watching and sign off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell. Courage at all times, my friends.